Why did Muhammad flee to Medina? Well, let's talk about that event in itself and build up the backstory there. Muhammad, in the year 622, fled from Mecca to Medina. He was invited by people in Medina because he was being persecuted in Mecca. Now, we call this the year 622 on the Western sort of system of dating things. On the Muslim system, this is actually called year 1 because this was such a significant event that his movement had gained enough traction to be accepted by a community of people in Medina. So year 1 on the Muslim system of dating, year 622 on the sort of Christian Western way of dating things. He fled to Medina from Mecca because he was being persecuted, but now we need to wonder why he was being persecuted in Mecca. So we're going to talk about 3 of the core claims that he had made by that point and that were starting to gain some traction. We're going to talk about the sort of interests that he was undermining by those claims. So he was undermining business interests, he was undermining religious claims, and he was undermining the intersection of religious claims and business interests. So let's talk about the claims that he made first. First, he prohibited usury. This is not a word we use very commonly anymore, but what it means is loaning money at exorbitantly high rates. So a sort of loan shark sort of situation. And he prohibited that. On the other hand, too, he prohibited the making of images of any human, deity, animal. Okay? So that was part of, and still is part of, Islam. Finally, one of the core tenets of Islam is a very strong commitment to monotheism. Muhammad thought that there was only one God, and that that God was unified completely in his nature and person. So those are the 3 claims that are going to get Muhammad into trouble in Mecca. How did they get him into trouble? Well, let's talk about usury. That might be the most obvious one, because it just turned out that in Mecca at that time, lots of people were making money, lending money at exorbitantly high rates. So they really didn't like Muhammad's claim that this should be prohibited. Now let's talk about his monotheism. Now, the background here is that this was hundreds of years after Christianity, thousands of years after Judaism had developed. And there was also an older religion in the area called Zoroastrianism. Now, these were all 3 very common religions in Muhammad's day in that area, and they were all monotheistic. But there were also many tribal religions still being practiced that were polytheistic. And so Muhammad's strong claim of monotheism was a challenge to those religions. Finally, many of the religions at the time relied heavily on images, whether statues or pictures or paintings or whatever. And so again, it was a straightforward challenge to the religious practices of the time. So we've seen how usury is a challenge to business practices, and the prohibition on image making and the strong endorsement of monotheism are a direct challenge to certain religious practices or beliefs at the time. But these 2 especially came to be challenges to business practices that were intertwined with religious practices at the time. So one thing that was happening a lot long before Muhammad was that pilgrimages to Mecca were a big thing for various religions and these tribal religions. So that became a big part of Islam, but it was already a big part of many religions before this. Mecca was a holy place for different religions. Now, because these pilgrimages had developed, as always happens in these sorts of situations, lots of business interests came in around that. It was basically a tourism industry around the practice of pilgrimages to Mecca. So there were people making money off selling food and garments or sacrifices or whatever. All of the things that develop around these sorts of long journeys to religious sites of religious devotion. So lots of people, lots of money was changing hands over that. And so if you undermine the tribal religions that are sort of the basis of those pilgrimages, you're undermining the business interests built on them. So that was another thing that got him into hot water. Similarly, something was happening with the prohibition on images. So it was a direct challenge to religious practice of having devotional practices based on images, but it was also a challenge to all of the business interests that had grown up around the making of images. So of course, if you're going to have statues and pictures and things like that, there's someone who is making those statues. They're often very fine works of art, right? So you might be making a lot of money off of those things, and if the religion is very popular, there are going to be lots of people making money off of those things. And so to come in and institute a prohibition on images is to undermine all of those business interests. that are based on that religious practice. So those sort of in brief are the reasons that Muhammad was being persecuted. It was the undermining of business practices directly, the undermining of religious claims and practices directly, and then the undermining and the challenge of business practice intertwined with religious practice and belief. So this is not uncommon. This has happened a lot in terms of religions who introduce a new element that is a challenge to not only religious claims and business claims or business interests, but the intertwining thereof. So we see a challenge or a parallel to this in the early Christian church. As the Christian message was spreading in the Greek world, the Greek-speaking world, it came to Ephesus, where it was a challenge to the silversmiths who were making silver statues of the various Greek gods. It's that these silversmiths all got mad because Paul, spreading this Christian message there, was undermining their practice. His monotheism, his Christian monotheism, and Jewish monotheism was undermining their practice of their sort of worship of the pagan gods by appeal to these statues and idols in Christian terms. So it's not an uncommon thing for these sorts of religious claims to cause a sort of political stir and to incite persecution of the person espousing these claims. So 622 is when Muhammad fled to Medina for that reason. And he came back to Mecca in 630 and conquered it militarily. But during those 8 years, he was in exile because of that persecution for these reasons.